Did you know that Teddy Roosevelt once survived an assassination attempt just before giving a speech? He famously continued to deliver his address with a bullet lodged in his chest. Talk about tough. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his wild and adventurous life. It is rare to find an American figure as significant in history as Theodore Roosevelt, a man who epitomized the essence of change. Although born into a life of luxury, he struggled with vulnerabilities and fragility before transforming himself through determination, evolving into an influential individual known for his dynamic actions, intelligence, and strong leadership. From the weak child named Teddy to the Rough Rider, from the progressive governor to the forward-thinking president, Roosevelt's tale is one of unstoppable vitality and fearless resolve. However, Roosevelt was not just the tough and aggressive persona commonly linked to him. He was a multifaceted individual, with a profound intellect demonstrated through his 30-plus authored books, a committed family man, and a fervent conservationist whose initiatives influenced the future of the American environment. His influence on the country, from dismantling corporate monopolies to constructing the Panama Canal, from creating national parks to broadening the powers of the presidency, continues to be significant. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, into a prestigious and affluent family in New York. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a generous entrepreneur, and his mother, Martha Mittie Bullock Roosevelt, came from a notable Southern family with strong connections to Georgia's pre-Civil War society. Despite this ancestry, the beginning of young Theodore's life was far from simple. Since his birth, Roosevelt has faced serious challenges due to asthma. His repeated attacks left him struggling to breathe, incapable of engaging in play with other kids, and restricted to his bed for extended periods. Roosevelt was greatly annoyed by these times of physical frailty as he yearned to participate in the active lifestyle of a regular boy. Instead of being discouraged by his condition, Roosevelt's father motivated him to develop mental strength, teaching him that he could overcome his physical limitations. Theodore Sr. would go for nighttime carriage rides with young Teddy in Manhattan, in the hopes that the cool air would help improve his son's breathing. The late-night travels, during which young Teddy gazed out at the busy city, may have sparked his desire to fully embrace life later on. Although Roosevelt had a frail body, his mental strength was remarkable. In the beginning, he cultivated a never-ending interest in the natural world. He gathered birds, insects, and other forms of wildlife, carefully organizing them in his private museum, and read books with a passion that stayed with him for the rest of his life. His favorite genre of books was adventure stories, which fueled his creativity and inspired a passion for exploration and physical challenges. When Roosevelt reached his teenage years, he had already made a crucial choice. After observing the strong bodies of climbers in the Alps while on a family trip, he famously stated, "I will make my body." It was a statement that determined the trajectory of his future. Roosevelt's newly acquired robustness led him to Harvard University in 1876, where he devoted himself to his studies with the same passion he had for boxing and rowing. While at Harvard, Roosevelt gained a reputation for his vitality and thirst for knowledge, immersing himself in topics such as biology, political philosophy, and law. He performed well in his studies, despite facing periods of ill health. Roosevelt's character started to develop while he was at Harvard. Some of his colleagues viewed him as eccentric because of his lively passion for everything, whether it was examining a bird or training in the university's gym. Despite participating in several clubs at Harvard, such as the Hasty Pudding Club and the Porcelain Club, which is one of the university's most esteemed social clubs, Roosevelt still felt like he didn't quite fit in. His inherent vigor, daring, and unrestrained zest for life frequently distinguished him from the more restrained individuals among the Boston upper class. During his time at Harvard, Roosevelt experienced not only intellectual and physical development, but also the presence of personal tragedy. During his second year of college in 1878, Roosevelt's father passed away unexpectedly from stomach cancer. The loss was extremely destructive. Roosevelt admired his father greatly, viewing him as a prominent moral figure in his life. This tragic event drove Roosevelt further into his interests, immersing himself in academics and exercise to help deal with it. In 1880, Roosevelt discovered joy in his private life by marrying Alice Hathaway Lee, an attractive young lady from a prominent Boston family. The couple soon became highly popular in New York and Boston social circles, and in 1884, they had their first child, Alice Lee Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt's happiness did not last long. Only 48 hours following the birth of their daughter, tragedy struck once more on February 14, 1884. Alice, his dearly loved wife, passed away from a serious kidney illness that had not been detected during her pregnancy. In a tragic turn of events, Roosevelt's mother, Mittie, also died on the same day from typhoid fever. Devastated and sorrowful, Roosevelt famously recorded in his journal on that day with a simple, heartbreaking statement, "The brightness has disappeared from my life." Roosevelt couldn't handle the intense sadness, so he withdrew from politics and social circles, entrusting his baby daughter to his sister before traveling to the Dakota Territory. There, he was about to embark on the next phase of his life. Roosevelt's choice to depart from New York and journey to the Dakota Territory following the passing of his wife and mother was, in several aspects, an escape from his inner struggles. The harsh terrain of the Badlands gave him the isolation and demanding physical obstacles he was seeking. Roosevelt purchased the Maltese Cross Ranch and then acquired a second one, the Elkhorn Ranch, situated deep in the wilderness. Over the following years, Roosevelt dedicated himself to ranching and embraced the traditions of the American West. He passed extended periods riding horses, guiding cattle, and chasing buffalo. The wilderness was wild, as were the individuals living there: cowboys, outlaws, and Native Americans. Yet Roosevelt excelled in this setting. The Badlands challenged him both physically and mentally, prompting him to cultivate the traits that would ultimately define him as a strong leader: resilience, decisiveness, and fearlessness. The Western region served as Roosevelt's demonstration area. He toughed out harsh winters, traveled long distances to catch cattle thieves, and confronted the challenges of living on the frontier directly. At a certain moment, Roosevelt himself captured 3 criminals who had stolen a riverboat, pursuing them in harsh winter weather and delivering them to face the consequences. Roosevelt's time in the Badlands influenced his perception of the American wilderness as a place of rough beauty and risk, where individuals could challenge themselves and reveal their authentic selves. His experience in the Western region further strengthened his dedication to preservation of the environment. Roosevelt saw the destructive effects of excessive hunting and inadequate land management, which motivated him to protect America's environment in the future. Even though Roosevelt's stay in the Badlands was short, the time spent there greatly influenced his personality and outlook on life. In 1886, he came back to New York, changed physically and emotionally, prepared to go back to politics with a renewed purpose. When Roosevelt returned to New York, he found himself once again drawn into the world of politics. He had briefly served in the New York State Assembly before his time in the West, but now he re-entered with a renewed commitment to reform. Roosevelt believed that the government had a responsibility to ensure fairness and justice for all citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful. Roosevelt's first major role upon his return was as a member of the United States Civil Service Commission, where he worked to reform the federal government by ensuring that jobs were awarded based on merit rather than political connections. His efforts made him many enemies in Washington, but Roosevelt's refusal to compromise his principles earned him a reputation as a man of integrity and determination. In 1895, Roosevelt was designated as the police commissioner of New York City, a role that empowered him to combat corruption at a municipal level. During that period, the police department in New York was filled with corruption and ineffective practices, with numerous officers prioritizing personal gain over safeguarding the city's residents. Roosevelt caused a stir by implementing broad reforms promptly. He took a tough stance on police corruption, implemented fresh training programs, and personally monitored the city streets at night to guarantee officers were performing their duties. His unconventional approaches, paired with his public image as a straightforward reformer, garnered him praise as well as backlash. Roosevelt enjoyed the challenge, viewing the battle against corruption as a moral mission. Roosevelt's role as police commissioner launched him as a promising figure in the realm of national politics. President William McKinley appointed Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897 after noticing his reputation as a reformer unafraid to challenge powerful interests. In this position, Roosevelt started to influence the next stage of his career, which would propel him onto the world stage. While serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt supervised the upgrade of the U.S. Navy, acknowledging the significance of naval strength in extending American influence internationally. He advocated for the building of fresh battleships and bolstered the Navy, foreseeing the imminent necessity for the United States to establish its presence internationally. His gut feeling was accurate. In 1898, conflict erupted between the United States and Spain regarding Cuba's future, giving Roosevelt a chance to implement his beliefs. He stepped down from his position and established the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, famously called the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders comprised a varied and diverse ensemble of individuals, including cowboys, miners, Ivy League athletes, and Native Americans. Under Roosevelt's guidance, they emerged as one of the most renowned combat units in the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt's time in the West had readied him for the challenges of military life, and he promptly gained his men's admiration with his courage and readiness to take charge up front. On the morning of July 1, 1898, American forces, including the Rough Riders, began advancing toward the Spanish fortifications atop San Juan Hill. The attack would become famous for its blend of bravery and chaos. Roosevelt, eager to prove himself in combat, led his men into the fray with intense resolve. The battlefield was a challenging and dangerous environment. The Americans had to advance through open terrain under a hail of enemy fire. Spanish soldiers were entrenched in well-fortified positions, raining down bullets from their protected vantage points. Despite this, Roosevelt pushed forward, riding a horse during part of the charge, though he eventually fought on foot to move through the rough terrain more easily alongside his men. Roosevelt's actions that day became legendary. As the Rough Riders faced the brutal Spanish gunfire, he is said to have charged up the hill with a mixture of grit and inspiring leadership. He called on his men to follow him, shouting encouragement as they faced heavy resistance. According to various accounts, Roosevelt didn't just stay behind a command. He was at the front lines, often exposed to enemy fire. This fearless leadership rallied the troops, and the sight of their commanding officer pressing forward motivated them to follow. One of the most remarkable moments came when Roosevelt and his troops reached the top of Kettle Hill, a key part of the overall San Juan Heights. After helping capture this position, they joined forces with other American units to continue the assault on San Juan Hill itself. Roosevelt's role in securing these heights was instrumental in turning the tide of the battle. His bravery and ability to lead by example in such dangerous circumstances won the admiration of his men and fellow officers alike. The Rough Riders, alongside other American forces, succeeded in capturing San Juan Hill, marking a decisive victory over the Spanish. This victory led to the eventual capture of Santiago de Cuba and was a turning point in the war, hastening the end of Spanish rule in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's actions during the battle were widely reported in American newspapers, and after the war, Roosevelt came back to New York as a true hero. His recently acquired celebrity status led him to be elected as governor in 1899, during which he continued to support progressive changes. However, his political journey had just started. In 1900, Roosevelt was chosen as vice president for President William McKinley's bid for re-election. Roosevelt hesitated to accept the role of vice president at first, viewing it as mainly symbolic and potentially isolating him from actual political involvement. Nonetheless, party leaders managed to persuade him that his fame as a war hero would ensure success in the election, and Roosevelt reluctantly consented. Nevertheless, destiny had different intentions. On September 6, 1901, during McKinley's second term, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz shot the president. 8 days after McKinley's death, Roosevelt, who was only 42 years old, became the youngest president in American history. From the time he assumed office, Roosevelt was determined to leave a lasting impression. He thought the presidency was an effective platform to promote progressive reforms and unite Americans behind his vision, commonly referred to as a bully pulpit. Roosevelt had limitless energy and enthusiasm, earning a reputation as one of the most involved and dynamic presidents in American history. One of Roosevelt's main objectives was to control the influence of big businesses, which he thought had become too strong and were hampering competition. He gained a reputation as a trust buster, challenging influential monopolies such as Standard Oil and the Northern Securities Company. Roosevelt thought it was the government's duty to make sure businesses treated workers and consumers fairly without exploiting them. Simultaneously, Roosevelt advocated for changes aimed at safeguarding the common citizen. His Square Deal initiative concentrated on three primary objectives: regulating companies, preserving natural resources, and safeguarding consumers. Roosevelt tried to create a more just society by regulating railroads, enforcing antitrust laws, and enhancing food safety with the Pure Food and Drug Act. Roosevelt's approach to race relations was complex, yet he was willing to take bold steps that few leaders of his time dared to. In 1901, he invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House, the first time an African American had ever been invited to such an occasion. The backlash from Southern politicians and the press was swift and vicious, but Roosevelt stood by his decision. He believed in recognizing the abilities of individual African Americans and took a significant step toward breaking barriers, even if the progress was slow. Roosevelt's views on race extended beyond African Americans. He was supportive of Japanese immigrants in California, even as anti-Japanese sentiment was growing. His belief in fairness and opportunity for all people, regardless of their background, was ahead of its time and demonstrated his willingness to challenge societal norms. Roosevelt's time in office was defined by a strong dedication to change, and his readiness to confront influential groups led to both critics and supporters. However, Roosevelt did not just concentrate on domestic issues. He also had an ambitious plan for America's presence on the global stage. One key aspect of Roosevelt's time in office was his assertive stance on controlling large corporations. In the early 1900s, the United States economy was primarily controlled by strong monopolies that had authority over various sectors like oil and railways. These trusts, commonly referred to as such, frequently participated in unethical business practices, eliminating rival companies and taking advantage of employees. Roosevelt held the opinion that uncontrolled corporate power posed a danger to democracy, and he leveraged the authority of the presidency to confront the trusts. His government brought forward numerous antitrust legal actions, prominently targeting J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, a large railroad monopolistic entity. The Supreme Court's decision in Roosevelt's favor marked a significant win for the federal government's power to control large corporations. Roosevelt's attempts to break up monopolies also aimed to encourage fairness and competition in the market. He felt that it was the government's duty to make sure that the economy benefited all Americans, not just a select wealthy few. His work set the foundation for future antitrust laws and reshaped the government-business relationship in the 20th century. Roosevelt's foreign policy was famously encapsulated by his slogan, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He thought that the U.S. should prioritize diplomacy whenever feasible, while also being ready to employ military force to safeguard its interests and uphold order. Building the Panama Canal was one of Roosevelt's major accomplishments in foreign policy. The construction of the Panama Canal is one of the most significant engineering feats of the 20th century, and Theodore Roosevelt played a crucial role in its development. His influence on the canal's building, both politically and personally, was instrumental in ensuring its completion. Roosevelt's vision, leadership, and decisive actions not only led to the creation of the canal, but also reshaped the geopolitical landscape and underscored the emerging power of the United States on the global stage. By the late 19th century, the idea of building a canal to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans had been discussed for decades. Such a canal was vital for international trade and military strategy, as it would allow ships to avoid the long and treacherous journey around the southern tip of South America. However, the idea was fraught with political and engineering challenges. Roosevelt understood the strategic importance of a canal. From a military perspective, the canal would enable the U.S. Navy to rapidly deploy ships between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, making it easier to defend both coasts. As a proponent of naval power and a firm believer in Alfred Thayer Mahan's theory of sea power, Roosevelt knew that control over such a waterway would enhance America's global influence. Economically, the canal would shorten trade routes and bolster the United States' role as a dominant force in global commerce. The French had initially attempted to build a canal through Panama in the 1880s, led by Ferdinand de Lesseps, the engineer behind the successful construction of the Suez Canal. However, the French effort collapsed due to severe engineering challenges, tropical diseases, particularly yellow fever and malaria, and financial mismanagement. By the time Roosevelt became president in 1901, the canal project was seen by many as a failed endeavor. At that time, the United States was considering two potential locations for the canal: Nicaragua and Panama, which was then part of Colombia. Nicaragua had been favored for its more straightforward terrain and fewer tropical disease outbreaks. However, Panama offered the most direct route and had already seen significant, if flawed, construction work by the French. Roosevelt was determined to secure Panama as the site for the canal. However, there were significant diplomatic hurdles. Panama was part of Colombia, and the Colombian government was reluctant to grant the United States the necessary control over the canal zone. Negotiations between the U.S. and Colombia began in 1902, culminating in the High Huron Treaty, which granted the U.S. rights to build the canal in exchange for $10 million and an annual payment. Unfortunately for Roosevelt, the Colombian Senate refused to ratify the treaty. Faced with this obstacle, Roosevelt took decisive and controversial action. He supported a group of Panamanian separatists who were seeking independence from Colombia. In November 1903, with U.S. naval support, Panama declared its independence. The United States quickly recognized the new Republic of Panama and signed the Haibanaw-Varilla Treaty with the newly independent government. This treaty granted the U.S. control of a 10-mile-wide strip of land, the Canal Zone, in exchange for $10 million upfront and annual payments. Roosevelt's role in Panama's independence has been the subject of considerable debate. While some have praised his pragmatism in overcoming Colombia's resistance, others have criticized his actions as imperialistic and a violation of Colombian sovereignty. Regardless of the controversy, Roosevelt's actions ensured that the United States had control over the Canal Zone, which was essential to completing the project. Once control over the Panama Canal Zone was secured, Roosevelt turned his attention to the formidable engineering and health challenges that had plagued earlier efforts. He appointed John F. Stevens as chief engineer of the project, who reorganized the construction effort and focused on improving the living conditions of the workers. One of Stevens' most significant achievements, with Roosevelt's full backing, was addressing the health crisis that had previously caused the deaths of thousands of workers. Roosevelt's administration brought in Dr. William C. Gorgas, a U.S. Army physician who had successfully fought yellow fever in Havana, Cuba, to lead the sanitation efforts in Panama. Gorgas implemented widespread mosquito control measures, drastically reducing the incidence of malaria and yellow fever. This was a turning point in the canal's construction, as it created a safer environment for workers and allowed the project to proceed without the crippling health crises that had doomed the French effort. In 1906, Roosevelt became the first sitting U.S. president to leave the country when he traveled to Panama to inspect the canal's progress. His visit was a powerful public relations move that demonstrated his personal investment in the project. Photographs of Roosevelt standing next to massive steam shovels and workers wearing his signature pith helmet were widely circulated, symbolizing his hands-on approach and commitment to the canal's completion. Although Roosevelt left office in 1909, the Panama Canal was completed in 1914, several years after his presidency. The canal transformed global trade, allowing ships to bypass the lengthy and hazardous route around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Its construction marked a significant triumph of American engineering, diplomacy, and medical science. Roosevelt's involvement in the Panama Canal left a lasting legacy. He saw the project not just as an engineering challenge, but as a symbol of America's growing power on the world stage. The canal became a crucial element of U.S. naval strategy, commerce, and influence throughout the 20th century. Moreover, Roosevelt's handling of the Panama Canal helped define his foreign policy doctrine, often summarized by the phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." His willingness to use diplomacy, backed by military strength, to achieve national goals was evident in his actions in Panama. While his approach drew criticism from those who viewed it as overly aggressive or imperialistic, it cemented the U.S. role as a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. In 1905, Roosevelt achieved another significant success in foreign policy by facilitating peace negotiations between Russia and Japan, who were fighting a harsh war over land in East Asia. Roosevelt's adept handling of diplomacy resulted in him being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, establishing him as the initial American to achieve this prestigious honor. During Roosevelt's time as president, he also oversaw the growth of the U.S. Navy, a priority for him in order to preserve America's power on the world stage. To showcase America's naval strength, he organized a global expedition of U.S. battleships called the Great White Fleet, solidifying the country's position as a world power. Roosevelt's strong dedication to conservation is one of his enduring legacies. Roosevelt, a lifelong nature enthusiast, saw the nation's natural resources as a valuable asset that must be preserved for the benefit of future generations. After spending time in the Badlands, he developed a strong admiration for the beauty and vulnerability of the American wilderness, prompting him to take decisive steps to protect it while in office. Roosevelt created 5 national parks, designated 18 national monuments, and preserved over 150 national forests, safeguarding over 230 million acres of land. He established the United States Forest Service to oversee the management of the country's public lands. Roosevelt's approach to conservation was significantly different from the common belief at that time, where America's natural resources were viewed as means for financial profit. Roosevelt's dedication to conservation went beyond just protecting the beauty of nature. It also aimed to secure access to the nation's resources for future generations. He thought that the government should oversee these resources in a responsible manner, considering both industry's needs and environmental protection. Roosevelt's impact on conservation still influences current American environmental policies. The national parks and forests he assisted in establishing are among the nation's most beloved public spaces, and his idea of responsible land management still influences both environmentalists and policymakers. After serving as president from 1901 to 1909, Roosevelt became increasingly dissatisfied with his successor, William Howard Taft, whom he had originally supported. Taft's policies, particularly his more conservative approach to government, clashed with Roosevelt's progressive ideals. Roosevelt's return to politics came after an unsuccessful bid to win the Republican nomination. When he lost the nomination to Taft, Roosevelt decided to form the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt famously said he felt as fit as a bull moose following his nomination. The 1912 election was a heated contest between Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate. Roosevelt was campaigning vigorously across the country, delivering speeches on his progressive platform that emphasized issues like social justice, direct democracy, and business reform. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt arrived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to deliver a speech at the auditorium. As was typical for his campaign stops, a large crowd gathered to greet him. After dining at the Gilpatrick Hotel, Roosevelt prepared to head to the venue for his speech. As he stood in an open car outside the hotel, waving to supporters, a man named John Flameng Schrank, a 36-year-old saloon keeper from New York, approached Roosevelt. Without warning, Schrank pulled out a .38 caliber Colt revolver and shot Roosevelt in the chest from close range. Remarkably, the bullet did not kill Roosevelt. Several factors contributed to this. First, the bullet had to pass through a thick object in Roosevelt's coat pocket, a folded 50-page manuscript of the speech he was about to deliver, and a metal glasses case. These objects slowed the bullet's velocity, reducing the severity of the wound. Still, the bullet lodged in his chest, dangerously close to his ribs. After the shot, chaos ensued. Schrank was immediately subdued by Roosevelt's bodyguards and nearby supporters. Some members of the crowd were prepared to lynch Schrank on the spot, but Roosevelt, ever the man of principle and self-control, ordered them to spare the shooter. He is said to have shouted, "Don't hurt him! Bring him here! I want to see him!" Roosevelt's bodyguards tried to convince him to go to the hospital immediately, but Roosevelt refused. Instead, he insisted on proceeding to the venue to deliver his speech. Before continuing, Roosevelt checked himself for signs of more serious injury, such as coughing up blood, which would indicate that his lung had been punctured. Finding none, he concluded that the bullet had not hit any vital organs. When Roosevelt arrived at the auditorium, the crowd was unaware of what had transpired. Despite bleeding from the chest and in obvious pain, Roosevelt began his speech with a dramatic revelation. "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He then proceeded to speak for 90 minutes, holding up the blood-stained manuscript of his speech to show the audience the bullet holes in it. Roosevelt's defiance in the face of such an attack thrilled his supporters and cemented his legendary status as a fearless leader. Throughout the speech, Roosevelt occasionally touched his chest, aware of the bleeding, but his determination to deliver his message was unshakable. After the speech, Roosevelt was finally persuaded to go to a hospital. Upon examination, doctors found that the bullet had lodged in his chest but had not penetrated his lung. Given the risks of surgery at the time, the doctors decided to leave the bullet in his body rather than attempt to remove it. Roosevelt's resilience astounded the nation. He spent about a week recovering in the hospital, though he remained under observation for several weeks afterward. Throughout his recovery, Roosevelt continued to stay involved in his campaign, though his doctors insisted that he reduce his public appearances. Ultimately, his vigorous campaign trail was curtailed, but Roosevelt's status as a man of extraordinary strength and determination only grew. The assassin, John Schrank, had a convoluted and delusional motive for attempting to kill Roosevelt. Schrank claimed that he had been inspired by a dream in which the ghost of President William McKinley, who had been assassinated in 1901, appeared to him. According to Schrank, McKinley's ghost instructed him to prevent Roosevelt from running for a third term, arguing that no president should serve more than 2 terms. Schrank believed that Roosevelt's pursuit of a third term was a violation of American democratic principles, and that his act of violence was necessary to uphold the sanctity of the presidency. It became clear after his arrest that Schrank was mentally unstable, and he was later found to be insane by a court. Schrank was committed to a mental institution where he spent the rest of his life. The assassination attempt became a defining moment of the 1912 campaign, further enhancing Roosevelt's larger-than-life reputation. Although Roosevelt's decision to run under the Progressive Party split the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson ultimately won the presidency, Roosevelt's courage during the assassination attempt contributed to his status as one of the most memorable figures in American political history. Roosevelt finished second in the election, garnering 27.4% of the popular vote, the strongest showing ever by a third-party candidate. He received more votes than the sitting president, William Howard Taft, but Wilson's victory was assured due to the split in the Republican vote. The attempted assassination of Theodore Roosevelt is remembered as one of the most dramatic and inspirational moments in American politics. Roosevelt's response to being shot, a combination of grit, determination, and theatrical flair, was emblematic of his larger-than-life personality. The bullet remained in Roosevelt's chest for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the event. In 1913, after losing the 1912 presidential election, Roosevelt took on one of the most dangerous adventures of his life, an expedition to explore the uncharted River of Doubt in the Amazon rainforest. This journey is one of the lesser-known but most thrilling chapters of Roosevelt's life. The expedition was full of dangers: hostile wildlife, tropical diseases, and the risk of starvation. Roosevelt nearly died from an infected leg wound, and the entire group suffered greatly from lack of supplies and harsh conditions. The River of Doubt expedition symbolized Roosevelt's insatiable thirst for adventure and pushing boundaries. His health was permanently affected. He lost over 50 pounds, contracted a tropical fever, and endured recurring bouts of illness. Yet, he never expressed regret. The journey was a testament to his belief in testing oneself, no matter the cost. To Roosevelt, a life without challenge was no life at all. His courage and resilience in the face of such adversity continue to inspire generations. Roosevelt's later years were marked by a struggle between his indomitable spirit and his failing health. After the River of Doubt expedition, his health declined steadily. He watched World War I unfold, lamenting the United States' initial neutrality. When the U.S. finally entered the war, he lobbied to lead a volunteer division, much like his Rough Rider days, but President Wilson denied his request. The death of his son Quentin, shot down over France in 1918, was a devastating blow. Roosevelt, who had always espoused courage and sacrifice, was proud, yet heartbroken. He had lived his life believing that one must face death with honor, and Quentin's sacrifice was a painful reminder of that belief. Roosevelt's own health continued to deteriorate, and he passed away in his sleep on January 6, 1919. Vice President Thomas Marshall remarked, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." In conclusion, the life of Theodore Roosevelt showcases the strength of determination, resilience, and a steadfast dedication to taking action of true American hero. From his early battles with sickness to his courageous guidance in war, in the White House, and on the global platform, Roosevelt consistently challenged the limits of what could be achieved. He changed the presidency, restructured American politics, and left a lasting influence that still motivates leaders and citizens. Roosevelt's belief in the importance of leading an active and challenging life was not just a principle for himself, but a challenge for all Americans to face difficulties, work towards success, and never back down from tough fights. His efforts in conservation, corporate regulation, and international diplomacy set the stage for many advancements in the 20th century. Ultimately, Theodore Roosevelt fully embraced life and made a lasting impact on his beloved nation. His impact continues not just through the actions he took, but through the bravery, exploration, and unwavering quest for fairness that he displayed during his extraordinary life. If you found Teddy Roosevelt's story as fascinating as I do, I encourage you to dig deeper. There are so many more incredible expeditions and conservation efforts that shaped our world. Be sure to check out our related videos on other influential historical figures who made a mark in their own unique ways. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on all our adventures through history. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.